Hello learners, welcome to EduWeb online classes. Today in this class, I will teach you pollination of the chapter flowering plants in class 9. So let's get started. So what is pollination, do you know? Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Okay? Pollination, there are two kinds. One is self-pollination, another one is cross-pollination. Now what is self-pollination? Now self-pollination means the transfer within the self. That means it can be the same flower, same complete flower, in which both the parts are present, male part and female part, in one flower. Then that transfer of pollen grain is known as self-pollination. Now what is cross-pollination then? Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from one particular flower, okay, to a different flower. There are some adaptations for self-pollination. Now homogamy, do you know what is homogamy? Now homogamy is where the stamen, that is the male part, and the stigma matures at the same time. So the timing is same, maturation, timing for maturation. Okay, so there is a certain point where this kind of pollination can take place. That is when the reproductive organs are mature. Okay, now here in homogamy, this is a kind of self-pollination or adaptation in self-pollination, that the stamen, that is the male part, and the stigma matures at the same time. So this is a bisexual flower, and maturation of the male part and the female part is together. Okay, so this is homogamy. Now what is cleistogamy? Now cleistogamy means where the flower is bisexual, but it does not open. Okay, open means it does not blooms like this. Okay, the pollen grains falls as they are closed. The exchange of pollen grains happens in between, within. Okay, so the pollen grains falls into the stigma and it gets pollinated. So they do not need any pollinating agent here in cleistogamy. In which flowers this cleistogamy happens? That is peanut. Okay, now there are some adaptations for cross-pollination as well. So the first kind of adaptation in cross-pollination is unisexuality. That means either the male part or the female part is present in one flower. That means unisexuality. So where we can find it? In maize. Next kind of adaptation is self-sterility. Pollens of one flower cannot fertilize the eggs of the same flower. That means cross-pollination. Now I have just now explained that in self-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of the flower to the stigma of that particular flower can happen. So to resist that, self-sterility is present. That means the anther of the same flower cannot fertilize the ova. Okay, that means it is self-sterile. Sterile means not have the power to reproduce. Okay. Next is dichogamy. Now what is this kind? Dichogamy, in some bisexual flower, the anther and the stigma mature at different times. Now what I already told in homogamy was the adaptation of self-pollination. Now dichogamy is the adaptation of cross-pollination, where in one flower, in different times, the maturation of male part or the maturation of female part occurs. That means stamen and stigma of the flower matures at different time. Now here two subcategories are present. One is protandry. Now what happens in this subcategory? The stamens mature earlier. Stamen matures earlier. Okay? Then the stigma. What is the example? Jasmine. Okay? So the male part here in the jasmine, the male part matures first. Then the female part. So this kind of adaptation is known as protandry. Next is protogamy. Now what happens in protogamy? The stigma matures earlier. Stigma matures earlier. Which kind of flower? Which kind of a flower? Rose. Okay. So unisexuality, self-sterility, dichogamy. Now one more is there, that is hercogamy. Now what is hercogamy? Now in hercogamy, stigma and stamen matures at the same time, but some barrier prevents the self-pollination. That means there is some barrier between the anther, between the stamen and the stigma. Between the stamen and the stigma. In the hercogamy, there is some barrier which prevents the self-pollination. That means transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same plant. Why? Of the same flower. Why? Because this is an adaptation of cross-pollination. Okay? That means they are adapted like this. Okay. Now one more is there, that is heterostily. Heterostily. Heterostily, in heterostily what happens? In heterostily, in such flowers, the style is either longer or shorter than the filament, so that the anther and stigma grows at different height, thus preventing the self-pollination. Now how is this looks like? If you can see this, here I have drawn the stigma. Okay, now here are the anthers. That means they have grown in the different heights, isn't it? They have grown in the different heights, so it prevents the self-pollination. Okay, so now we will shift to the agents of cross-pollination, because cross-pollination always needs an agent.
Who all are the agents of pollination? Those who help in the transfer of pollen grains, like insects, like wind, water, birds. Okay. Now, when agent of pollination is insects, that means the pollination is occurring with the help of insect. Insect is an agent. Then this kind of pollination is known as entomophily. Okay, the flower should be colored, scented and contains nectar. Why? To attract insects, so that the insects come and sit on the flower and then again move to the other flower, and ultimately transfer of pollen grain occurs. So the characteristics of these kind of flowers should be brightly colored, isn't it? And nectar will be present. Next, pollination by wind, that is also known as anemophily. The flowers are colorless. Why? Because it is pollinated by wind. So the flowers contains light-weighted pollen grains so that it can be blown away by winds. The pollen grains are light, dry, and winged. The stigma may be branched or well exposed. Why? So that they can catch the pollen grains coming in the wind. These anemophily can happen in maize. Next is pollination by water, that is also known as hydrophily. As we know, in Vallisneria, this hydrophily happens. The pollen grains contain air space so that these can float on water. Okay, now the pollen grains from the male flower is floating and then reaching to the female flower. Okay, so like this, pollination happens with the help of water flow. Next is ornithophily. This is a kind of pollination in which the agent is bird. The characteristics of the flower are it can be brightly colored, it can possess edible parts so that the birds can eat them, okay, and they can perform pollination. Example, begonia. Next is zoophily. Pollination by animals where the agent is animal. Okay, agent is an animal. Now the kind of flower is Rafflesia. Now the last type, that is the artificial pollination. It is done by human beings. In this method, the anther of a flower are removed. Once the anther are removed, the flower is covered by plastic bags. Then the pollen from a good variety is transferred to the stigma of this plant. This kind of pollination is done by human being so that they can get the desired variety. In the next video, I'll cover the topic fertilization. Thank you, and if you like this video, please subscribe our channel, comment down below and share with your friends. Thank you.